History is not just a story of kings, palaces, and wars. It is primarily a story of masses, social structures, and sociological ruptures. This is precisely what distinguishes the French Revolution from an ordinary peasant revolt, transforming it into an earthquake that shook the world to its core and rattled empires. To understand this great upheaval, we need to examine the rigid, ruthless, and decaying social structure of pre-1789 France under a microscope. This system, which historians call the Old Regime or Ancien Regime, was essentially a colossal tower of inequality with a ticking time bomb attached. At that time, French society consisted not of citizens with equal rights in the modern sense, but of three distinct classes separated by enormous and insurmountable chasms. In this system, vertical mobility, or the possibility of climbing the social ladder, was virtually non-existent. Your identity was determined not by merit, but by the cradle you were born into. Let's start at the very top of this pyramid, the first class, the clergy. Although the clergy constituted less than 1% of France's 26 million population, they alone owned a tenth of the country's most fertile land. They had an autonomous structure within themselves, their own courts, and even collected a compulsory religious tax from the people called tithe. But did this wealthy institution pay taxes to the state? Almost none. They only made a symbolic donation, determined at their own discretion. Immediately below them was the second house, the aristocracy, also known as the nobles. This group, comprising only 2% of the population, completely monopolized the command of the army, the high courts, and the most crucial positions in the state bureaucracy. Believing they were born privileged by the right of the sword, this class lived in enormous castles, in the splendor of the famous Palace of Versailles, completely isolated from the reality of the people. Like the clergy, they were exempt from the state's heaviest taxes. Moreover, they continued to collect feudal taxes, remnants of the Middle Ages, from the peasants who worked on their lands. And at the very bottom, that enormous, dark mass, the third estate, 98% of the population. Even within this estate, there were enormous cultural and economic differences. At the very bottom of this estate were millions of peasants tied to the land, living on the brink of starvation, burdened by paying taxes to the state, the church, and the nobility. A notch above them were the laborers and artisans working in harsh conditions in the narrow streets of the cities. However, the group that would truly create an explosion was different: the bourgeoisie. This educated class, comprised of merchants, bankers, doctors, and lawyers, had achieved tremendous economic power through commerce. They debated the ideas of the Enlightenment, shaping the mentality of society, but had no say in state administration. Historical sociology always tells us the same universal truth. A class that holds economic power will eventually demand political power as well. If this demand is not met peacefully, it will seize that power by force. This was the picture in France. The 98% who produced everything, bore all the burden, and paid all the taxes were carrying the 2%, the parasites who reaped the benefits of the state, on their backs. This institutional injustice was inherently unsustainable. All it took was a small spark to ignite this powder keg. We have seen how unjust and fragile the social structure is. However, historical reality shows us that people can endure injustice for decades, even centuries, until hunger knocks on their door. This is what ignited the fuse that destroyed the enormous system built on inequality in France, the economy, and hunger. By the end of the 18th century, France was literally on the verge of bankruptcy. The biggest reason behind this bankruptcy was the monarchy's insatiable thirst for war and geopolitical ambitions. As if the enormous military and economic devastation brought about by the 7 Years' War wasn't enough, the French crown made an incredibly ironic decision: simply to strike a heavy blow against their eternal rivals, England, on the international stage, they financed the American Revolutionary War across the ocean. Imagine, a king who ruled his own country with an absolute monarchy was sending millions of gold and a huge army to rebels across the ocean who were rebelling against the kings and wanting to establish a republic. This move may have wounded England, but it completely emptied France's treasury. The coffers were now completely empty. King Louis XVI was a weak-willed, introverted leader, utterly incapable of managing such a massive crisis. The only solution that came to mind to close the hole in the treasury was to increase taxes on the oppressed 98%, the Third Estate. The privileged nobility and clergy categorically refused to share the burden of the state, to reach into their pockets. But the people no longer had a single penny to give, not even half a loaf of bread to put on the table. In the midst of this economic crisis, nature also turned its back on France. 1788 saw an unprecedentedly harsh winter, followed by a disastrous harvest season. Fields dried up, crops froze, famine gripped the entire country. At that time, bread was the staple food of the average Frenchman, so much so that they obtained almost 80% of their daily calories from bread alone. But when the flour ran out, bread prices skyrocketed within a month, making it impossible for an ordinary worker's monthly wage to even buy that dry bread, barely enough to keep their family alive. Bakeries were looted in the streets, and people trampled each other for a loaf of bread. The palace, however, was completely detached from this sociological catastrophe. While the bodies of those who had died of starvation were being collected in the streets of Paris, balls continued in the famous Palace of Versailles, and glasses clinked in silk dresses. It was no coincidence that Queen Marie Antoinette became a symbol of arrogance, extravagance, and alienation in the eyes of the people. There was hunger in the streets, but indifference in the palace. This was the most concrete and tragic example of a state becoming alienated from its own people, and no state in history has ever survived by turning a deaf ear to the cries of its subjects who were starving. Finally, the situation reached a breaking point. King Louis XVI had crashed into that inevitable wall of history. To prevent bankruptcy and to be able to impose new taxes, he resorted to one last desperate measure. He was forced to convene the Estates General, that dusty institution that had been neglected for 175 years. This decision was, in effect, an official admission of the desperation and collapse of the absolute monarchy. When that assembly convened, nothing would ever be the same for France again. On May 5, 1789, the famous meeting that would change the fate of France began at the Palace of Versailles. King Louis XVI had finally convened the Estates General after a full 175 years. But even the manner in which the assembly convened and its opening ceremony was a small theatrical display of the injustice in France. In the palace's enormous hall, clergymen in their most opulent silk robes and nobles with their swords and feathered hats took their places in the front rows reserved for them. The delegates of the Third Estate, representing the 98% who bore the brunt of the nation's burden, were merely required to wear black, unpretentious clothing and were relegated to the back corners of the hall. Yet in the eyes of these enlightened representatives of the people, mostly lawyers, doctors, and merchants, there was great hope. They believed they could finally make their voices heard, that they could bring about reforms for a fair tax system and equality. But this hope would very quickly give way to great anger. The crisis erupted in the most fundamental workings of the assembly, the voting system. The number of representatives of the Third Estate was equal to the total of the other two estates. However, according to royal rules, voting was to be done per estate, not per person. What did this mean? The clergy had one vote in total, the nobility had one vote, and all those millions of French people had only one vote. Whatever reform, whatever demand for justice, or whatever tax law was presented to the assembly, the two privileged classes immediately agreed amongst themselves and rejected the people's demands with a 2-to-1 vote. This blatant mockery completely exhausted the patience of the bourgeoisie and the people's representatives after weeks of debate. Sieyes, an enlightened clergyman among them, asked the famous question, "What is the Third Estate?" Everything.
What has it been in the political system until now? Nothing. What does it want to be? Something. They declared, if we produce everything in the country, if we create everything, then we are the true assembly, and burned their bridges. On June 17, 1789, they announced their separation from the other two groups and declared themselves the sole legitimate representative of France, the National Assembly. Now they had only one goal, to write a new constitution for France where there would be no privileges and everyone would be equal before the law. King Louis XVI panicked upon hearing of this unprecedented rebellion. To crush this audacious assembly before it even began, he had the doors of the assembly hall locked by soldiers under the pretext of renovations. However, that day would prove that no door lock could stop an idea. On the morning of June 20th, the delegates who arrived at the assembly building and saw the soldiers at the door did not back down in the pouring rain outside. They took refuge in a nearby indoor tennis court where the nobles played. It was there that the momentous oath that would change the course of history was sworn. Hundreds of representatives raised their arms and shouted in unison, "No power can remove us from this hall until a just, egalitarian, and new constitution is written for France." The oath sworn that day on that tennis court heralded not only a new constitution, but also the end of an outdated era. The first seed of the transition from subjects to citizens had been sown. But the palace would not accept this, and soon things would spill out of the assembly halls into the streets reeking of gunpowder.
The momentous oath taken on the tennis court had sent shockwaves through the palace walls. Despite his weak character, King Louis XVI panicked at this unprecedented civil disobedience. Outwardly, he adopted a stance of reluctantly recognizing the assembly and its demands for a new constitution. But behind closed doors, he was putting a far darker and bloodier plan into action. He began amassing a massive army of tens of thousands, mostly foreign mercenaries, around Paris and Versailles. As renowned Swiss and German regiments encircled the city, a terrifying whisper spread rapidly through the streets of Paris. The king would dissolve the assembly, arrest the intellectuals, and massacre the city. The spark that ignited this fear, transforming it into absolute paranoia and then rage, struck on July 11th. The king suddenly dismissed and exiled Jacques Necker, the finance minister whom the people saw as their only hope for a way out of the crisis, and who had shown a moderate approach to the assembly. The momentous oath taken on the tennis court had sent a shockwave through the palace. When news of Necker's dismissal reached Paris, it was perceived not merely as a political appointment, but as a declaration of war by the court against the people. The streets instantly erupted. A young and fiery journalist named Camille Desmoulins climbed onto a table, raised his pistol in the air, and delivered his famous speech, "Citizens, Necker's dismissal is a death knell for patriots. Tonight, Swiss and German battalions will come to slit our throats. We have only one option: arm ourselves." This call was enough to mobilize the vast mass of people, the Third Estate, who had been oppressed for centuries, starved, and had nothing left to lose. The angry crowds first stormed the military hospital known as the Invalides, seizing tens of thousands of rifles. But there was a huge problem. They had weapons, but they lacked gunpowder, and everyone knew exactly where the gunpowder was. On July 14, 1789, tens of thousands of Parisians stormed the gates of the Bastille, the colossal fortress that symbolized the absolute power, tyranny, and oppression of the kingdom. The Bastille was more than just a prison. It was a terrifying psychological symbol where summary executions were carried out at the king's command, and people were left to rot in dungeons for years. Its walls were 30 meters high, and its cannons were pointed directly at the streets of Paris. The crowd demanded that the prison warden, Marquis de Lannoy, surrender the gunpowder and withdraw the cannons. After hours of tense waiting, as the crowd entered the courtyard, the soldiers opened fire.
That first shot heralded an irreversible bloodshed. After hours of fierce fighting, bloodshed, and thick smoke from gunpowder, the crowd managed to break through the main gates. The Bastille had fallen. The prison warden was lynched, and his severed head, impaled on the tip of a spear, was paraded through the streets of Paris amidst shouts of triumph. That night, King Louis XVI simply wrote nothing in his diary, as he hadn't shot a single animal that day. When he was awakened from his sleep and informed of the fall of the Bastille, he asked in astonishment, "Is this a rebellion?" The answer he received proclaimed the beginning of a new era. "No, Your Majesty, this is a revolution." The century-old psychological wall had been broken, and the monarchy had been forced to submit. However, no one yet knew that this violence that had spilled onto the streets would soon consume their own leaders.
The fall of the Bastille had shattered the wall of fear, but the real earthquake was happening miles away from the capital, in the countryside. Millions of peasants, upon hearing the news of the victory in Paris, rose up to free themselves from the weight of feudalism that had burdened them for centuries. In what historians call the Great Fear, peasants stormed castles, set fire to the mansions of the nobility, and, most importantly, tore up the obsolete feudal documents detailing their debts. The violence of the streets and the social anger forced the National Assembly to make radical decisions. By August, in that historic night session, the National Assembly hammered the final nail into the coffin of the century-old regime. Feudalism was abolished completely and forever. All the privileges, tax exemptions, and judicial supremacy of the nobility and clergy were wiped out overnight. Immediately afterwards, on August 26, 1789, the unique text that would fundamentally change the course of world political history was published, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This declaration was a brand new social contract not only for France, but for all of humanity. Its first article roared to the whole world, "Men are born free and equal in rights and remain so." This single sentence shattered the divine rights of kings and the blood supremacy of the nobility. People were no longer the subservient subjects of a king, but citizens with rights and freedoms. The foundations of the modern social structure and the principle of equality were laid with these lines. However, there was a very bitter truth. People could not fill their stomachs by consuming rights that existed only on paper. In Paris, the queues in front of the bakeries grew longer every day, and bread prices, far from falling, were constantly increasing. Moreover, news from the Palace of Versailles was driving the people's anger almost to madness. According to rumors, the king's guards, at lavish banquets in the palace, had trampled on and insulted the tricolor badges, the symbol of the revolution. When hunger and humiliation combined, history would once again show how destructive mass psychology could be. On October 5, 1789, the most striking and impactful scene of the revolution to date unfolded. This time, the instigators were not intellectuals, lawyers, or politicians. Thousands of angry women working in the Parisian marketplaces, unable to find a morsel of bread to feed their children, marched towards the Palace of Versailles with sticks, scythes, axes, and even stolen cannons. This massive army of women, marching for miles through rain and mud, demanded not only bread, but also that the king himself come to Paris to be among the people. The next morning, they broke down the palace gates and stormed inside. Overcoming the guards, they reached directly to Queen Marie Antoinette's bedroom. The queen narrowly escaped with her life by fleeing through a secret passage. The enormous palace of Versailles echoed with the screams of thousands of Parisian angry women. The king had no options left. He conceded defeat and, stepping onto that famous balcony, announced his return to Paris. King Louis XVI, the Queen, and their children were escorted to Paris to the Tuileries Palace, accompanied by tens of thousands of women singing victory songs and guards with their heads impaled on spears. The king, who had absolute power, was now a prisoner in his own capital among his own people. The strongholds of the monarchy had fallen one by one, but the thirst for blood in the streets had not yet been quenched.
The revolution breathed a sigh of relief when the king and queen were forcibly brought to the Tuileries Palace in Paris by angry mobs. The National Assembly was finally writing the constitution it had dreamed of, abolishing feudalism and transforming France into a constitutional monarchy. This meant the king would remain on the throne, but his powers would be limited by the Constitution and the People's Assembly. From the outside, King Louis XVI appeared to have submitted to this new order, accepting the revolution. He had even sworn an oath of allegiance to the Constitution in front of the people. However, behind the closed doors of the palace, a far darker and bloodier plan was being meticulously crafted. The king, and especially Queen Marie Antoinette, could never accept the loss of the absolute power that had belonged to their family for centuries. For them, this assembly, this constitution, and that famous Declaration of Rights were merely pieces of paper. And finally, they put their grand, treacherous plan into action to secretly flee Paris, reach the Austrian border, the Queen's homeland, gather foreign armies and exiled French nobles there, and crush the revolution in its own capital with bloodshed. This was no escape. It was calling upon a foreign army to help against one's own people. It was, quite literally, treason. On the dark night of June 20th, 1791, the plan was put into action. The royal family disguised themselves as ordinary bourgeois and servants. Louis XVI, the absolute ruler of France, wore the attire of an ordinary valet. Under the cover of darkness, they secretly left the palace and boarded a carriage. But the royal arrogance and detachment from reality were evident even in their escape. Instead of a small, swift, and inconspicuous carriage, they chose a massive, ostentatious, and rather slow carriage drawn by 6 horses. After hours of tense travel, they were very close to their destination, the safe zone. But in a small town called Varennes, one of history's most ironic events unfolded. Jean-Baptiste Drouet, a stagecoach attendant, stopped the suspicious and ostentatious carriage at midnight. The face of the servant-like man inside looked very familiar to him. He pulled an ordinary metal coin from his pocket and compared the king's profile on it to the man's face. Yes, it was none other than King Louis XVI himself. The king had been betrayed by his own minted coin. News spread in seconds. Armed mobs surrounded the carriage. The royal family was arrested, and they were taken back to Paris in shame. But the return journey was far more chilling than the outward journey. Tens of thousands of Parisians poured into the streets upon the king's arrival, but there was not a single sound, not a single applause. The House of Commons had put up posters proclaiming, "Those who applaud the king will be beaten. Those who insult the king will be hanged." The enormous crowd watched the carriage in deadly silence. That silence was the funeral of a belief that had endured centuries. Until that day, no matter how hungry they were, the people had always seen the king as a sacred father figure, blaming his corrupt advisors for their suffering. But the escape from Varennes shattered this illusion. The king was no longer a father, but a traitor who wanted to sacrifice them to foreign armies. That sacred and psychological bond between the monarchy and the people was irrevocably broken in the streets of Varennes, and whispers gave way to loud shouts. We no longer need a king, we need a republic. The flight from Varennes marked the end of innocence and the beginning of paranoia for France. The royal family's attempt to seek refuge with foreign armies overturned all political balances in the assembly and on the streets. Deep cracks began to appear within the assembly itself. The chasm between the conservatives, who sat on the right and advocated for a more moderate constitutional monarchy, and the radical Jacobins, who sat on the left and wanted to completely abolish the king and establish a republic, grew steadily. The concepts of right-wing and left-wing that we use in political science today originated precisely from this seating arrangement in the assembly during those days.
The other great monarchies of Europe, especially Austria and Prussia, were mortally afraid that the fire of revolution in France would spread to their own subjects. With mutual threats flying, in April 1792, France made a preemptive move to protect the revolution and declared war on Austria. However, the army was in disarray. Most of the commanders were nobles and had fled the country. As the French army suffered heavy defeats on the battlefield, enemy troops advanced to the outskirts of Paris. At this critical moment, the Duke of Brunswick, commander of the Prussian forces, issued his audacious manifesto, declaring, "If the people of Paris inflict the slightest harm on King Louis XVI and his family, we will burn and destroy Paris." However, this threat, instead of frightening the French people, erupted in an unprecedented outburst of rage. If the enemy armies were coming to protect the king, then the king was certainly a traitor. On August 10, 1792, the true masters of the streets, the enraged Parisians known as the Barefoot Mob, seized the Tuileries Palace, where the king resided, in a bloody raid. Hundreds of Swiss guards were slaughtered, and the king and his family were arrested and thrown into a dark dungeon. That day, the 1,000-year-old vast French monarchy was effectively overthrown. The National Assembly was dissolved and replaced by the National Convention, elected directly by popular vote. Their first decision was decisive. On September 21, 1792, the monarchy was completely abolished and the French Republic was proclaimed. No one was a subject anymore. Everyone was a citizen. But the most deadly question of the revolution hung in the air unanswered: what to do with a captive king? During the tense trial in the Assembly, which lasted for weeks, Maximilien Robespierre, the leader of the radical Jacobins, took the podium and uttered the famous, historic sentence that shook the entire hall. "The king may be innocent, but the revolution is real. Louis must die so that the nation may live." The decision was made: death. The date was January 21, 1793, a freezing winter morning in Paris. The former absolute monarch, King Louis XVI, now simply known as Citizen Louis Capet, was brought to the Place de la Révolution in an ordinary horse-drawn carriage. He was laid under the guillotine, the revolution's new, humane, and egalitarian invention. The cold, harsh sound of the blade falling and the display of the severed head to the crowd was the death announcement not just of a man, but of an entire era. The thrones of all kings in Europe were now shaking, but the king's blood would bring not peace for France, but an unprecedented reign of terror.
The execution of the king marked the point of no return for France. Now all the great powers of Europe, England, Spain, the Netherlands, and Austria, had declared war on France to eradicate this republican plague. The country was under siege from the outside by massive armies, and internally, particularly in the Vendée region, large pro-royalist peasant revolts had erupted. The young republic was on the verge of suffocation the moment it was born. This unprecedented survival crisis brought with it extraordinary and bloody measures. Under the pretext of protecting the revolution from internal and external enemies, the National Convention delegated all executive power to a group of 12, the Committee of Public Safety. The undisputed leader of this committee was Maximilien Robespierre, known as the Incorruptible, a cold-blooded radical man who believed himself to be obsessively virtuous. Robespierre's philosophy was chillingly simple. In peacetime, the foundation of popular government is virtue. In revolution, it is both virtue and terror. Without virtue, terror is murder. Without terror, virtue is weakness. This mindset opened the doors wide to the terrible nightmare that would go down in history as the Reign of Terror. The Suspects Act, enacted in September 1793, was the final nail in the coffin of law and justice. You no longer needed to engage in any counter-revolutionary activity. Not appearing enthusiastic enough, a neighbor spreading gossip about you, using a word left over from the old regime,
or simply being deemed suspect was enough to send you to the guillotine. Courts became death factories. The right to legal representation or self-defense was completely eliminated. The verdict was always the same: acquittal or death, and most often it was death. In just a few months, the bright streets of Paris that had championed human rights at the beginning of the Revolution literally turned into a bloodbath. Queen Marie Antoinette, the moderate intellectuals who ignited the first spark of the revolution, scientists, and even ordinary bakers, tailors, and peasants. Every day, dozens of people, their hair cut and their hands tied behind their backs, were loaded onto those infamous wooden carts and taken to the guillotine in the Place de la Révolution. The guillotine blade rose and fell so many times that shopkeepers in the surrounding area began to complain about the smell of blood permeating the street. Paranoia had spiraled so out of control that the revolution began to devour even its most ardent defenders. Even Danton, Robespierre's closest comrade in arms and the revolution's booming orator, was arrested for saying, "Let's not shed any more blood, let's end the terror." As Danton went to the guillotine, he would utter his famous and defiant words to his executioner: "Show my severed head to the people, it is worth seeing." Even Danton's execution chilled the blood of everyone in the assembly. No one, not even the most loyal servants of the revolution, was safe anymore. The members of parliament went to sleep every night fearing, will I be the one in that death chariot tomorrow? There was only one way left to stop this bloodbath, to defeat this monster, to destroy the man who created it.
Historical sociology whispers a definite rule to us. No society can live in constant crisis, violence, and revolutionary fervor. Collective psychology eventually tires, and extreme radicalism, sooner or later, prepares its own end, giving way to a search for absolute order. This is exactly what was to happen in France. But this search for order required a final and horrific bloodbath beforehand. By the summer of 1794, Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety had completely spiraled out of control. They enacted a brand new law they called the Great Terror. This law even abolished the obligation to hear witnesses and present evidence in courts. Justice literally turned into a slaughterhouse. In just 6 weeks, more than 1,400 people were sent to the guillotine in Paris. Death had become so commonplace that the guillotine square had become one of Paris's daily entertainments and centers of gossip. But Robespierre made a fatal, arrogant mistake. He was so convinced that he was at the height of his power and that no one could touch him, that on that famous July 26th, he ascended the rostrum of the National Assembly and delivered his historic, menacing speech. He declared that he had a new list of traitors, that there were enemies of the revolution even within the assembly, and that all of them would have their heads cut off. But he did something crucial. He didn't read the list. He didn't name names. This ambiguity bound everyone in the assembly together in a fear of death. That night, for the first time in their lives, rightists, leftists, moderates, and radicals united for a single purpose: survival. Because no one knew whose name would be read on the list the next day. The only solution was to cut off the hand holding the list. The next day, the 9th of Thermidor, according to the revolutionary calendar, when Robespierre again approached the assembly rostrum to speak, something unprecedented happened. The assembly members began to shout in unison, "Down with the tyrant! Death to the dictator!" Robespierre tried to speak, but his voice was drowned out by the furious shouts of hundreds of deputies. He was stunned and horrified. The enormous machine of terror he himself had created was now turned against him. An arrest warrant was issued that very day. After a brief confrontation, Robespierre was captured, severely wounded in the jaw and covered in blood. The next day, he was placed in the infamous wooden carriage that had once sent thousands to their deaths. The streets of Paris echoed with the slogans, "Death to the tyrant." When Robespierre's bloody bandage was removed and he was laid under the cold blade of the guillotine, the crowd in the square held its breath. When the blade fell,
and his severed head rolled into the basket, an unprecedented thunderous applause erupted in the square, lasting for minutes. Robespierre's death went down in history as the Thermidor reaction. The reign of terror officially ended, the prison doors opened, and that heavy, bloody nightmare finally came to an end. France was now in a state of profound sociological trauma and exhaustion. No one wanted to hear about revolution, equality, or virtue anymore. The street had only one demand: peace, security, and order. And to ensure this absolute order, an artillery officer with his sword would soon emerge onto the stage of history.
The Reign of Terror ended with Robespierre's execution by guillotine, but France was still a powder keg. The Directory government, which attempted to rule the country, was incompetent, corrupt, and detached from the demands of the people. The streets were empty, and the borders were still threatened by the vast armies of Europe. The people were tired of cries for freedom, seeking a loaf of bread to put on their tables and a safe environment to walk in the streets. History teaches us that great chaos always creates its own iron fist. It was in this climate of uncertainty that a young, ambitious, and brilliant artillery officer born in Corsica emerged on the historical stage: Napoleon Bonaparte. Having become a legend in the eyes of the people through his incredible victories on the battlefield, Napoleon seized power in a coup in 1799. The French Revolution had begun to end the absolutism of a king. However, at the end of a decade, it had resulted in another absolute power, Napoleon, who declared himself Emperor of the French. At first glance, this might seem like a failure, but the truth is much deeper. Napoleon transformed the ferocious energy of the revolution into a systematic state structure. His Napoleonic Code carried the fundamental principles of the revolution, equality before the law and secularism, across Europe with his armies. Neither Europe nor the world could ever be the same again. So, what did the French Revolution leave us with? The operating system of the modern world we live in today was written during those 10 bloody years. Empires and kings were replaced by nation-states. People ceased to be the property of a monarch and became citizens with constitutional rights. The idea of nationalism spread like wildfire, redrawing the maps of the 19th and 20th centuries. Concepts such as secularism, democracy, and fundamental human rights became the common heritage not only of France, but of all humanity. The French Revolution was a dark tragedy that devoured its own children on the guillotine, but it was also the greatest explosion that shattered the shackles on the human mind. The angry crowds shouting before the Bastille in 1789 were in fact experiencing the birth pangs of today's free individual. As we conclude our series, let us remember liberty, equality, and fraternity. When these three words echoed through the streets of Paris in 1789, they were merely a slogan. Today, however, they are the unshakable foundations upon which our civilization is built. History is not a past confined to dusty pages. It is the vast river that determines who we are today. Thank you for accompanying us on this 10-part epic journey through the French Revolution. Until we meet again on the dusty roads of history in a new story.